I would like to thank Charles Emory, our head of the Board of Trustees, and of course the director of the IAS for co-financing this lecture series, and the IAS staff, in particular Lee Sandberg, Marcia Tucker, Meredith Lozier, and Uta Nitschke, who helped us an awful lot. Tonight we have 3 distinguished speakers who will each give 15-minute statements, and then we can open up the floor to questions. Before introducing our speakers, a word of explanation. In my country, Germany, many former National Socialists remained in power long after 1945, evading prosecution and rewarding each other with ample pensions. By the time I became a student in the 1990s, a new generation of judges, historians, and politicians managed to change all this. No school child in Germany today has failed to learn about the Holocaust, and whenever you turn on the television, you will see documentaries on the Nazi period. A few things have happened, however, that have made me anxious. One of my most respected colleagues, John Röhl, is an expert on Emperor William II. He has found many new sources. In 1920, for example, William II argued that Germany would never find peace until, quote, all the Jews had been slaughtered. Among other measures, William II pronounced himself in favor of pogroms, and in 1927 he had a particularly prophetic idea, quote, Jews and mosquitoes are pests which humanity must eliminate one way or another. I think gas would be the best way. So that's in the late 1920s. To me, these quotes were pretty obvious, but apparently I was mistaken. At a recent conference, one German historian explained to me that this was just a form of reactive anti-Semitism, whatever that means. Supposedly understandable, because the overthrow of the monarchy had been spearheaded by Jews and cost William II his throne. This bizarre reinterpretation of German history comes as news to me and no doubt to all of you. I was also surprised when another more famous German historian, Wolfram Pütter, tried to whitewash the guilt of William II's oldest son, who had hoped to rule with Hitler and who had bragged that he had won 2 million voters for the Nazis. The AfD, the party of the far right in Germany, is currently trying to dismiss all this as of no significance. They are supporting these arguments. One of its leading politicians, Alexander Gauland, called the Nazi period just a bit, and that's a quote, just a bit of bird shit in Germany's great long history. True, the period lasted 12 years, but the death toll was no more than bird shit. Is anti-Semitism and a rehabilitation of Hitler's supporters now socially acceptable? And why is a far-right party like the AfD in Germany suddenly so popular in Eastern Germany? Are people attracted to this party because it is a general protest party, or is it their anti-Semitism that appeals? Germany is a healthy democracy with a stable party system, and that gives some cause for comfort. Our leading historians are standing up against revisionist history. Our courts send culprits to prison for denying the Holocaust. But is this an effective solution to anti-Semitism? Unfortunately, the anonymity of the digital age makes it more and more difficult to get hold of people who spread their lies and conspiracy theories online. It would therefore be wrong for us to be complacent. Something is happening in our society, and we do not know whether we will soon face a tidal wave or a tsunami. Our first speaker tonight will help us understand what is going on. Deborah Lipstadt is the Dorot professor at Emory University and has received honorary doctorates from many institutions. She has been described by Lord Finkelstein, another of our panelists, as a gutsy girl. And that is British understatement. In 2000, she had to fight a Holocaust denier in a famous libel case in London, and many of you were here last week to watch the film Denial about the case. Her latest book, well, she has written many, so you know that. Her latest book is Anti-Semitism Here and Now. With this, she has won the National Jewish Book Award for the second time round. Please welcome Deborah Lipstadt.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. If you were expecting Rachel Weisz, I'm sorry if you're disappointed. Recently, a well-educated, accomplished man, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, one of America's most successful corporate entities, attended a seminar I gave on anti-Semitism. After my presentation, he raised his hand with a perplexed tone in his voice and observed, quote, "Jews are so smart, so accomplished. How is it that they have not been able to solve the problem of anti-Semitism?" I told him that his question, sincere as it was addressed in the wrong direction. He should not be asking the victim of racial prejudice to solve that problem. He should be asking the perpetrator. The purveyors of this hate and hostility should be the ones who bear the onus of having to resolve the issue. It's the rapist and not the person who has been raped who should have to supply both the explanation and the solution. However, since in this case it is the Jew who bleeds, suffice it to say it is a problem for all of us. Now, there's no easy solution to anti-Semitism as a prejudice. Anti-Semitism is a form of prejudice. It's an irrational sentiment. I don't know what reactive anti-Semitism is, right? Think about the etymology of the word prejudice. Prejudge. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. I know a person's qualities. I know exactly who they are and what they are just by virtue of their identity. As a colleague of mine likes to say, you meet the stereotype right in front of your nose while the person themselves is still 500 meters away. In other words, the stereotype exists independent of the individual's actions. Now, that doesn't mean that a member of a particular group in question, in this case Jews, is immune from possessing negative characteristics ascribed to the entire group. There are Jews who have negative characteristics. In fact, last week I gave testimony on Capitol Hill at the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee, and I was talking about this fact, and I said, some of the people I dislike most are Jews. But the minute you move from the individual to the whole group, that is anti-Semitism. Similarly, that is racism as well if you're talking about a racial group. And the minute you say that is how they are, that's anti-Semitism. Now, while anti-Semitism is a prejudice, and as a prejudice it shares many of the characteristics of racism, homophobia, fear of Muslims, sexism, and other prejudices, it has certain unique characteristics, and I want to lay those out because I think they'll be helpful in the conversation that will follow. First of all, it is a conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theorists find culprits, so to speak, to blame for something they find personally threatening. Those who subscribe to these theories tend to rely on familiar enemies. There was a joke that was supposedly told in Germany during the Third Reich by Jews of a Nazi official who comes to a meeting and is saying the Jews are our misfortune, they do this and they do that, and someone from the side of this crowded room yells out, and the bicycle riders. And the person is confused, and he says, why the bicycle riders? And the person says, why the Jews? In other words, it makes no sense. But you pick someone who's familiar. Bicycle riders would surprise people. But if you say it's the Jew, then it makes sense because it's a familiar stereotype. Conspiracy theorists reflexively reject facts that contradict their narrative. So logic falls by the wayside. You can't argue with a conspiracy theorist. You're going to lose out from the very beginning. Secondly, anti-Semitism has a second unique, distinctive characteristic. Most prejudices of the sort that I've been talking about tend to come from the political right, the far political right. Anti-Semitism, as we're going to hear later in more detail, comes from both the right and the left, but uses the same prejudices. It's not a distinct kind of anti-Semitism of the right is one thing, and anti-Semitism of the left is another thing, but they use the same kind of prejudices, and they fit. The charges are the same. Thirdly, when one contrasts anti-Semitism, let's say, to the prejudice of racism, another distinction emerges. The racist looks at the person of color, the black person, the brown person, often the Muslim, and says, if they, quotation marks, come to our neighborhood, our country, there goes the country. If their kids come to our kids' school, there goes the school. They will bring it down. They are lesser than. Think about how some of the Nazi press, well, all the press was Nazi press in 1936 at the Berlin Olympics, explained Jesse Owens' victory. They had to explain it. How could a black man beat the fastest Aryans, not only beat them, but his athletic feat, and you can spell feet either way, and with Jesse Owens you'll be right. How could he accomplish this? And what did they say? On the evolutionary scale, he's closer to an animal than a person. Therefore, even the fastest Aryan could not beat a horse. So the racist punches down. The person of color is lesser than. The anti-Semite, who's often just the racist, just a different version, punches up. The Jew is more powerful than us. The Jew is cleverer than us. The Jew is richer than us. The Jew is out for their own good. Therefore, the Jew is to not only be loathed, but to be feared for what they might do to us. And that changes the nature of anti-Semitism. Of course, anti-Semitism is delusional. Think about it. It ascribes to Jews, it says Jews are all on the left, they're all communists and revolutionaries. Or it says they're all on the right, they're Rothschilds, or today Soros has become the 21st century Rothschild. Last time I checked, you could not be on those two sides at the same time. Or the anti-Semite says Jews are pushy, they always want to be in places that don't want them. Or they're clannish, they stick together and they don't mix with others. Well, last time I checked, you can't be both things at the same time. But that's logic, and as I say, anti-Semitism defies logic. It's not something random. It is not disliking a Jew, it is disliking someone because he is a Jew. These things seem so obvious, but sometimes I think we fail to put them together. Anti-Semitism began as anti-Judaism. As Christianity emerged from Judaism and became distinctive, it also wanted to set itself apart, and in the Middle Ages, the attacks on Jews became quite intensive. But it moved out of the church. It moved to opponents of the church, people who did not love the church. Voltaire writes about Jews. He sounds like he'd be a church father in his words. Or it moves out of the religion altogether to the enemies of religion, to a Karl Marx, but who uses the same kind of languages, right, left. Moves to the eugenicists in the mid-19th century. It moves, of course, to the Nazis. It takes its different forms. It is ubiquitous, and it is rightfully often called the oldest hatred. Now, a recent form, and I know many of you saw the movie, so I'm just going to touch on this briefly, is, of course, Holocaust denial. Sometimes people say to me, how can someone deny the Holocaust? And I say, you're asking a logical question about an irrational sentiment. Think about it. For a denier to be right, who would have to be wrong? The thousands, tens of thousands of documents which attest to the existence of the Holocaust. The Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. Number one. Number two, the bystanders, the people who lived in the towns and the cities and the villages, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Lublin, who saw the trains going to the camp filled with people coming out empty. Or all the people in the towns and the villages on the Eastern Front who watched the shootings, who saw the Jews being marched out, and sometimes even accompanied and watched it happen. But the thousands of historians who work on this all over the world would either have to be part of the conspiracy or have all been duped. And finally, the perpetrators themselves. In not one war crimes trial since World War II has a perpetrator ever said it didn't happen. They said, I was forced, I didn't have a choice, but never that it didn't happen. And of course, the German and Germany as well. So it makes no sense. Why do deniers get any traction at all? Because they rely on these age-old stereotypes. If you were to ask a denier, let's say after they've told you all these examples, mangling history and mangling the facts, the logical question you would ask is, why? What's in it for the Jew to engage in anti-Semitism? What's the logic? What's the rationale? And their answer relies exactly on anti-Semitic stereotypes. What the denier will say to you, what did the Jews, and I put this also in quotation marks, get out of the Holocaust? They would, and the denier would say, well, they got a state of Israel, which is questionable historically, but that's the general perception. And what's the other thing they got? Reparations, which is a fancy word for money. So there you immediately have the Jew is financially powerful, the Jew is very sneaky and doing things for their own purposes. So you've given the person a rationale that is logical within this illogical stereotype and makes sense to them. What about, and I'm just going to do this briefly, anti-Semitism from the left, because we're going to hear more from this from Lord Finkelstein. And for the person on the right, the far right, the shooter in Pittsburgh, the shooter in Poway, even the shooter in New Zealand who killed Muslims at 3 different mosques, for the shooter in Halle who killed 2 people, couldn't get into the synagogue, and I think whoever reinforced that door, the carpenter or whatever who put that bolt on that door in Halle should get Germany's highest award. For those people on the far right, they subscribe to something called white genocide theory, white genocide replacement theory, which essentially argues that there is a plan to replace white people, white Christians, replace white Christian culture, replace white Christians' dominance and leadership of society with black people and brown people. And that's what we see happening in Europe with the influx of refugees. But, says these people, white supremacists, racists, those people, remember punches down, those people are not smart enough, are not capable enough to be doing this on their own. There has to be someone behind them who is controlling this. There's always someone the puppeteer. Who's the puppeteer? Who's going to benefit from this? The Jew. So when they talk about George Soros funding these refugee groups coming from south of the border, or they talk about him doing it in Europe, that is, again, you're punching up. And that's what the protesters in Charlottesville meant when they marched and they said, Jews will not replace us. On the left, it comes from a worldview of Weltanschauung, which argues that Jews are white. For the people on the right, of course, Jews are not white, but that Jews are white, and Jews are all wealthy, and ipso facto, they cannot therefore be victims of prejudice. They have power. So when they come and claim that I'm a victim of prejudice, I've been a victim of anti-Semitism, they're making it up. Because it's not possible, says the person, not everyone on the progressive left, of course, but those on the progressive left who make this argument, and therefore they're making it up. And then there's the added element, says the person on the progressive left, such as Jeremy Corbyn, who we'll hear more about, or people in our country and some in the Congress and in other places as well. And I call this the Miss Piggy defense. Moi, me, You know, how could I possibly be a purveyor of prejudice? I'm liberal to my core. So if you can't be a victim and I can't be a purveyor, you must be making this up. You must be using this for other ends. Finally, irrespective of whether it comes from the right or the left, it has that same template of financial power, cunning, clever manipulation, and used for their own benefit. What can we do about it? I'm not sure we can ever wipe it out. On some level, I think of anti-Semitism as a herpes virus, and I don't mean to be facetious at all. Those of you who know someone who had a herpes virus, you know it can lie dormant in your body. It never goes away. It comes out at times of stress. Anti-Semitism, being the oldest hatred, is present. It's in the atmosphere. It's out there. Does that mean there's nothing we can do? Of course not. We must, expose its delusional quality, its irrational quality. We must challenge it. We must become the unwelcome guests at the dinner party and call it out. Maybe you won't change the mind of the person engaging in it, but the people around the table, especially, but not only the young people, have to recognize that this is unacceptable. We live today in a society where the moral guardrails, as I like to say, have come down, and we have to help establish them and set them up. We have to do so, and with this I close, not just for the Jew, whether we're Jewish or the Jews in our midst, though that's a good reason, and not, you know, some people say, well, I'm not Jewish, but I have Jewish grandchildren, relatives, etc. Good reason, not sufficient. Or I hate all prejudice. Good reason, not sufficient. The real bedrock reason is no healthy democracy has ever harbored anti-Semitism and been a healthy democracy. If you have anti-Semitism within a democracy, it means there are many people who believe in conspiracies, Jews controlling, Jews manipulating. If they begin to believe in conspiracies, that is the beginning of the death of democracy. So if you care about democracy, you care about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very passionate speech. And I know you have lots of questions, but please keep them. You know, we will come to that because we haven't got so much time, so we need to hand over now to Julie Gottlieb, Professor Julie Gottlieb. She was born in Canada and is a professor at the University of Sheffield in the UK. She works on modern British political history, the history of political extremism, and women's history and gender studies, and her most important publication is Feminine Fascism, Women in Britain's Fascist Movement. And perhaps you have read her interview with the New York Times about the Nancy Astor statue, but she will tell us more about that in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, to my magnificent colleague, Dr. Karina Urbach, for your generous hospitality and for realizing your vision here of organizing this, unfortunately, very timely event here at the Institute of Advanced Study. It's a privilege and an honor, and just a little bit intimidating, of course, as well, to be addressing the issue of anti-Semitism, past and present, together with Professor Lipstadt and Lord Finkelstein, and to share a stage with these esteemed colleagues who, let us not forget, have made such brave contributions both to the scholarly but especially to the public understanding of anti-Semitism. Now, my contribution will be to talk about the history of extremism and anti-Semitism in the British context, and even more specifically, the role of women as victims and purveyors of hate. I'd like to offer some thoughts about how the history of fascism and anti-Semitism in Britain has informed and resonates with a new wave of populism on both right and left, and symptomatically, of course, the resurgence and the mutation of anti-Semitism and Judeophobia. In November 1938, a couple of days before Kristallnacht, a conservative politician, Sir William Maxwell, was addressing the women's branch of the Conservative Association in Aberdeen. After cataloging all the hot spots of Jewish persecution, he claimed that in Britain there was no Jewish problem. The Jewish population numbering only 300,000, the overwhelming number being in London, Leeds, and Manchester. And then he continued to say that they all knew that while Jews mingled with the people they settled among, they remained apart from them, a peculiar, even an unpopular people. Okay, so the first thing you're going to say with friends like these, right? But it is very much a question of scale, and will immediately be struck by the glaring paradox in the British case. Britain was the European country with arguably the cleanest record on political anti-Semitism and its culmination in the Shoah. Not by any means spotless, but we're speaking here in relative and comparative terms. Today, though, it's the setting for some of the most vigorous and vitriolic discourse about Jews and debates on anti-Semitism. It's never a good thing, let's put it this way, when Jews are news. This point can be punctuated in many ways, but possibly the most dramatic one to note is that in December 2019, so just 2 months ago, the Simon Wiesenthal Center deemed Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn the greatest global threat to Jews. How times have changed. Indeed, it was against a very different backdrop that I began my research on women in Britain's interwar fascist movement, similarly in the early 1990s. I started this work, as I say, in the mid-1990s at a time when, despite the regrouping of the far right in the British National Party and its worrying electoral success at local level, especially in the East End, fascism and anti-Semitism seemed to occupy a political space safely at the margins. Fascism had been largely discredited and delegitimized and consigned to kind of a dark age before 1945. By the end of the decade, of course, the verdict in April 2000 in the David Irving v. Penguin Books and Deborah Lipstadt trial was a great vindication of the truth and confirmation that Holocaust denial was beyond the pale. I could not, nor would I have ever wanted to predict that those were in some ways halcyon days, and that the historical material that I worked would again be so salient in my own lifetime. The growing feeling of malaise has been exacerbated by who I am and where I come from. I'm a first-generation Canadian, the daughter of parents who were child survivors of the Holocaust in Hungary. And then in their youth, they escaped to Canada, where they arrived as refugees in 1957. I myself made the choice to return to Europe, and I want to stress, especially on this day, or since the 31st of January, that Britain is still Europe. Where I studied and I have taught for the past 25 years. Now, to immerse myself in the history of the 1930s was hardly accidental, and it probably goes without saying that my scholarship was used, of course, to unravel many ancestral mysteries. Having said that, I turned myself and my attention to Britain, not to continental Europe. I turned my attention not to the victims, but to the perpetrators, and even more specifically to fascist women. Strikingly, the first fascist movement to emerge in Britain was called the British Fascisti. It was founded in 1923, and even more strikingly, it was founded by a woman, a young woman called Miss Rotha Lintorn Orman. In the 1930s, Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists was 25% female. They had their own women's section, and sensationally, it's a small number, but it was used, and it's actually been reused to great effect, exaggerated, I think, but 3 of Mosley's female followers had been suffragettes in the lead up to the First World War. So this was very counterintuitive on many levels. Now, working this terrain required me to challenge a priori ideas about women's nature, about assumptions, about the exclusive marriage between feminism and progressivism. I sent myself careering out of my comfort zone by making contact, by interviewing those who had been active in Mosley's movement. Still, some were in advanced old age and ready and indeed quite eager to speak. And of course, what was particularly noteworthy here is that they were largely unrepentant. For instance, I corresponded with Diana Mosley, wife of Britain's fascist leader, Oswald Mosley, but also confidant of Hitler. And I knew full well what she thought about the Jews, and I of course also noted that after the war she had relativized the Shoah, to play it down, to deny its singularity as an atrocity, and certainly she would never have gone anywhere near the language of genocide. So the challenge was to understand these women as more than, on the one hand, the sufferers of some kind of false consciousness, who were themselves victims of kind of a fascist machismo and a fascist misogyny. And on the other hand, to try to depict these women as more than kind of paper doll villains, witches, and evildoers. I wanted to avoid the temptation to see them as kind of black shirts on broomsticks, if you like. So the title of my first book, Feminine Fascism, was, please note, deliberately not feminist fascism. That would have been just as alliterative, and of course it would have been much more provocative and headline-grabbing. But one of the central points is that we have to acknowledge women's political engagement and agency outside of the framework of feminism. So would I have come to the same conclusions had I worked this project 20 years later in our own present moment in history? I think it's a question worth asking. So in the British context, there were many signs that the political pendulum was swinging and pretty much out of control. It's difficult to pinpoint one moment of kind of apprehensive epiphany on my part, but if pushed, I would say, of course, it was the shocking murder of the MP, the Labour MP, Jo Cox. She was killed during the UK's EU referendum campaign in 2016 by an assassin who was inspired by fascism and neo-Nazism. And this tragic turn of events opens the areas I want to discuss a little further now. We can tease out a number of the strands of this tragic event to illuminate the changes and continuities in the history of extremism and anti-Semitism in Britain. So first I'm going to give a little background to the British far right, and especially the British Union of Fascists, an organization, let's remember, that trumpeted the slogan "Britain First" in the 1930s, and well before Jo Cox's killer, Thomas Mair, shouted, "Britain first, this is for Britain," in his murderous rage. Second, I'd like to think more about why it's relevant that the victim of this political murder was a woman. And here's some more context to the horrendous spike in violence and threats of violence against women in public life in the present, and even more so, of course, this applies to minority women. Third, from there I'm going to argue that the category of gender is actually fundamental for our understanding of anti-Semitism past and present. The DNA of anti-Semitism, to continue with socio-medical metaphors, is made up of what I would call a double helix of hate, racism, and sexism. Finally, I'm going to bring all these elements back together, these disparate strands, to frame the story of a very recent controversial event that Karina has already mentioned, and one that has important Anglo-American dimensions, namely the unveiling of a statue of the first woman MP to take her seat, Nancy Astor. And that happened 100 years ago in November. It was always going to be tricky, of course, to make a feminist icon of the Virginia-born, prejudiced, pro-appeasement Tory woman who first took office because her husband was elevated to the House of Lords. And I suppose Daniel will be able to tell us more about that from an insider perspective. But nonetheless, the whole matter got even further entangled in this cyclone of anti-Semitism that dominated the weather map during the general election in November-December 2019. So, what was the nature of that first wave of fascism in Britain? The most successful organization to model itself on Italian fascism first and then align itself with German National Socialism was Mosley's British Union of Fascists. It was formed in 1932. It reached its greatest point of strength in about 1934 when it had the support of the Daily Mail and Lord Rothermere, the press baron and the owner of the Daily Mail. It went into decline thereafter, and it ended its days in 1940 as a prescribed organization under the Defense Regulations, Defense Regulation 18B more specifically. So why did fascism fail in Britain? A number of peculiar characteristics of British political culture have been used to explain why fascism remains on the margins. And I'm going to allow me to go through a couple of these at breakneck speed, but obviously we can look at in more detail at many of these factors. So what are those factors? The first, past the post electoral system, which tends to not give political space to extremist movements. Britain's physical isolation as an island apart from the continent. The success and stability of conservatism on the one hand, and the constitutional and evolutionary nature of laborism on the other. The pattern of gradual recovery from the shock of the Great Depression that denied Mosley the crisis that he was depending on. The ethno-religious makeup of the British Isles. Another factor, of course, is that Britain is on the winning side during the First World War. It doesn't have access or recourse to the stab-in-the-back myth that fuels the far right on the continent. We have a national history, too, of evolutionary rather than revolutionary change. Very powerful here, too, is a vague but character-defining idea of British tolerance and pluralism, ideas of fair play, of support for the underdog. Let's also remember the class structure. And here, the monarchy and the aristocracy are kind of blocking elements here. The way that the elite adapts to mass democracy. Let's think, of course, about the continued popularity and the ideas behind something like Downton Abbey as a really good example of that. And even another stereotyped but interesting characteristic is the British sense of humor that cannot abide the silliness and the trappings of fascism. So think if any of you are fans of P.G. Wodehouse, how he characterized the black shirts as the black shorts, for instance. Now, fascism in Britain has been a consistent presence, in subtle but insignificant ways. In a general sense, since the 1930s, political legitimacy has derived from and depended on being anti-fascist. It's so fundamental that it almost goes without saying. So we have the construction, of course, of the myth of the British People's War from 39 to 45. Now, this is mythological, it's also problematic, but it's so potent in Britain because Britons imagine themselves to be the antithesis to Nazism. It's telling that in 2005, the BBC History magazine put together a list of the worst Britons in a whole 1,000-year period. And who was selected for this dubious honor was none other than Oswald Mosley. He topped the poll. But I think this might have lulled us into a sense of kind of a false sense of security. I do wonder, actually, if continued interest and prominence of fascism in British society right now actually is more down to seeing kind of fascination turning into fear and hatred. I don't think it's an accident either that Mosley, who was dubbed the Rudolph Valentino of fascism, is now making a comeback and on the small screen. Anatomically and historically inaccurate Mosley figures have appeared in the latest season of Peaky Blinders, which has a big popular following, and in another example in the BBC miniseries World on Fire, which aired in the autumn of 2019. So what does this resurgence of anti-Semitism in the past couple of years in Britain say about continuities and disjunctures in the stories of British political extremism? To be clear, British fascism was never free of anti-Semitism, despite claims that it was only 2 years after the formation of the movement in 1934 that political anti-Semitism was explicitly adopted as party policy. The fascist groups already in the 1920s, particularly the British Fascisti, which I've already mentioned, was obsessed with the alleged power and influence of world Jewry. It spoke openly and with paranoia about the alien menace. They disseminated the infamous protocols of the Elders of Zion. Nesta Webster, who has quite a disturbing following here on this side of the Atlantic, had been associated with the British Fascisti, and she remains one of the internationally best-known conspiracy theorists of all time. Jews were held accountable, to pick up on many of the tropes that Deborah's already mentioned for us, for communism, for capitalism, for criminality, for cosmopolitanism, for the Hollywoodization of British culture and values. They were depicted as sexual predators, as outsiders and infiltrators. And from 1938, the British fascists had already designated the coming world conflict as the Jews' war. So these card-carrying and black shirt-wearing fascists gave free rein and unleashed a reign of terror on Jewish communities, especially in the East End in the 30s. That being said, though, let's not forget that the history of anti-Semitism isn't only about these extreme examples. And anti-Semitism was present and could be encountered at all levels of society, in other political parties, at work, and in social interactions. So let me just for a moment turn the spotlight onto gender. Indeed, a recurrent motif in the fascist anti-Semitism in Britain was misogyny, and this was expressed both figuratively and physically. Jewish women were a soft target for fascist fury, and they were considered fair game for harassment and intimidation, especially in the East End of London. Further, in the fascist imagination, feminists and feminism were conflated with Judeo-cosmopolitanism and decadence. These are ideas that were arguably propelled by kind of deep male insecurities as a consequence of the First World War and women's ascendancy in the electorate. The ideal fascist anti-type, of course, just to give us a real kind of personification of this, was a figure like Rosa Luxemburg, a communist, a pacifist, an intellectual, and of course a Jew. So I've written a lot about the women perpetrators, fascist women who fulfilled their roles as haters and Jew baiters. They transformed motherly love into motherly hate, embracing their biologically ordained roles to position themselves as protectors and defenders of the race and of nation. In practice, this meant that fascist women in Britain protested against the admission of Jewish refugee children, even though that was very late in the day. They hurled abuse on Jews within their own community, and they were tasked with infiltrating women's organizations to spread their hate and prejudice. Fast forward now to the late 2010s. A striking feature of this current global surge of anti-Semitism is how it is characterized and indeed reinforced by sexism and attacks on women. In general, women in public life are being badly affected by the skyrocketing levels of toxicity in the political culture since the EU referendum. And minority women, as I've intimated already, have come in for much of that abuse. More specifically, we can't but be struck by how Jewish women in British public life have been hounded, especially three who have now left the Labour Party, MPs Margaret Hodge, Luciana Berger, Ruth Smeeth, and Louise Ellman. In October 2010, a neo-Nazi attempted an attack, of course, on a synagogue in Halle, which was another very good example of what I'm describing as that double helix of hate. So all of these women are victims of this double helix of hate, targeted and victimized because of their sex and in combination with their ethno-religious identity. Those who have targeted these courageous Jewish women have been borrowing freely from the playbook of the 1930s, and that is the case whether the perpetrators claim allegiance with the left or the far right. So I began with a personal anecdote, and I'm going to indulge you just for another moment to end with another one. An interesting flashpoint of all this, these new mutations of anti-Semitism was the public outcry over the erection of the statue of Nancy Astor, which was unveiled in a very high-profile way by former conservative Prime Minister Theresa May. This occurred on the 28th of November 2019 in Astor's constituency in Plymouth. The date was absolutely not chosen because of the election. It was, that was the precise 100-year anniversary of her election campaign, her by-election campaign 100 years before. But the date became very fraught because Boris Johnson wanted to try to polish his tarnished his tarnished image with women voters by posing with the new bronze statue. A media circus ensued. Now, as the Twitterati did not tire of pointing out, Astor was not the first woman to be elected to the UK Parliament. That had been Sinn Féin's Countess Marwick Markovic in 1918. But that was a minor detail, and what really sent Twitter into overdrive was the fact that Astor's political record was a very messy one, to say the least. She's one of the key figures in another book of mine called Guilty Women, Foreign Policy and Appeasement, because, of course, she was a key figure in the whole appeasement campaign. There I try to balance her active efforts at Anglo-German friendship, her back-channel diplomacy with leading Nazis, and her nauseating prejudices. She was anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic, with Southern Confederate family ties, so essentially equal opportunities. Nonetheless, as I say, both from right and left, this was greeted with great whataboutery and perturbation. All right, just to finally conclude, this was a thorny issue for me personally, too, as a woman, as a historian, and as someone from a Jewish background. I felt vulnerable on many levels. The political has inevitably and without choice become personal. Nonetheless, I want to end on a more uplifting note, and it's therefore quite an honor to speak after Professor Lipstadt and before Lord Finkelstein. In Deborah Lipstadt's remarkable and prize-winning book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, her intimate knowledge of contemporary anti-Semitism, combined with her impeccable scholarship, I think can provide us the guide we need to call out anti-Semitism, to fight it, and to survive it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker has promised to keep the time limit. He's not just a token man, but highly qualified. Lord Daniel Finkelstein is a British journalist and politician who sits in the upper house as a Conservative. He served as advisor to Prime Minister John Major and was elevated to a peerage by Prime Minister David Cameron in 2013. He's a renowned political commentator and former chairman of the UK-based think tank Policy Exchange. He's also a vice president of the Jewish Leadership Council and writes for the Times, of course, and the Jewish Chronicle. Welcome, Lord Finkelstein.
Well, thank you very much, Karina, and it was very stimulating to hear my two co-speakers. It's also delightful to be here with so many people. I did once give a speech in Norwich in the UK, which involved me travelling for 4.5 hours to get there, and when I got there were only 2 people. And one of them was the person that invited me. The other one, he waited until I'd finished speaking, and I asked him whether he wanted to join the cause I was there for, and he said he would, but it would interfere with the terms of his parole. So I'm pleased that I've got, hopefully, certainly a bigger audience, hopefully with fewer criminal convictions. I'm going to talk about 3 things. Briefly, who I am, then what has happened in Britain, and finally, the intellectual origins of the rise of left anti-Semitism. I'm the son of 2 refugees. One is a survivor of concentration camps, the other of Stalin's deportations to the east. And I live in a quiet London suburbs, and I value it. And as I said in my maiden speech in the House of Lords, my mother was in Belsen and my father was in Siberia, and Pinner is nicer. So I put a high value on stability and on peace. My father's mother, my grandmother, always used to say, while the Queen is safe in Buckingham Palace, we're safe in Hendon Central. And on my 50th birthday, I told my guests how lucky I was that the fate that had befallen my parents and my grandparents had not befallen me, and that it never would. And it was unthinkable. And I think if I'd been giving that 8 years ago, if I'd been giving that address to my friends now, I wouldn't talk with the same confidence. I might not even say the same things. Perhaps that's a little bit unrealistic, but it's certainly how lots of Jews in Britain feel. It's not just a feeling about the immediacy of politics. It's a general feeling abroad about politics and politicians and about democracy. And I just wonder what the alternative is to politicians. If a man on a white horse arrives to cleanse the nation and sweep away corruptions, we all know who will be doing the sweeping and who the swept will be. So I'm nervous about the rise of nationalism and populism in Europe. I fear the rise of a crude right, and I don't take any comfort from the fact that in Britain, the right is too busy hating Muslims to spend too much time on Jews. And that would be a false comfort to take indeed. It is, however, I think, a reasonable observation of the political scene. It does mean that it has been left anti-Semitism that has had the most immediate impact on Jews. And let me provide a short, very short necessarily, history. In 2015, the Labour Party held a leadership contest after it had lost another election. And it allowed new members to join for only £3, and they could vote in the leadership election. It was, as you might guess, flooded with hundreds of thousands of people. And they elected as their leader a man called Jeremy Corbyn, someone who most of them knew very little about, save that he was a radical, he was breaking sharply with the Blair-Clinton consensus. But a few people did know him because they had been his comrades in decades of struggle on the far left. David Graeber wrote an article recently, I think it was in the New York Review of Books, and he said it was a bit like electing Chomsky to be leader of the party, right? So it was somebody who had been familiar to quite a niche audience, was not generally known by a bigger audience, but came with a lot more baggage than somebody who might just simply be a figure of the somewhat more radical, somewhat more demonstrative left. Corbyn's central campaigns had all been about foreign policy issues. And slowly but surely, it turned out that quite a lot of the campaigns and the activities that he had been involved in touched upon Jews. He'd welcomed Hamas and Hezbollah to Parliament and described them as friends. He'd consorted and defended with Holocaust deniers, with blood libelists, and with 9/11 conspiracy theorists, explicitly defending and supporting each of those people in each of those categories. He then, and this was, I think, a climactic event, was revealed to have defended an anti-Semitic mural, the content of which would not have looked out of place in Die Stürmer. And he had also laid a wreath at the site of the Munich murderers. Now, his leadership brought vocal support for him and for these positions. There was an odd thing on the left where people would say he really didn't do it, and if he did, he was right. And they seem to want to have it both ways. But as it pulled in people into the party who were copying the leader or justifying the leader or merely coming from the same political position as the leader, and people began to complain about those. Jeremy Corbyn's reaction was to do nothing. His team claimed that the Labour Party had a tough procedure for dealing with comments on social media, which began to explode with use of terms of Rothschild Jews and comparisons of the Jews to the Nazis. But all the time, it would take maybe a year for somebody to be investigated for having put a meme on social media of the Statue of Liberty with a Zionist insect on its face, and they needed a year to study whether that was anti-Semitic, and at the end of this year they would often give a light sanction, so they would have to go on a training course provided by other far-left activists who became something called the Jewish Voice for Labour, which was outside the official Jewish labour movement, which is 100 years old this week, but they gave this training to another group entirely. As the Jewish community explained and complained, the Corbynistas attacked back. So the Jews were Trump supporters. This was quite an often used. The rabbis were Tory stooges. And Jewish activists felt under increasing assault in their own constituencies. And several, as Julie said, several Jewish members of parliament quit the party. The one encouraging part of this story is that it turned out to matter. Politically, it turned out to matter. For those of us who are used to the fact that people pay very little attention to politics, I was completely stoic about the fact that our first opinion polls showed that people didn't know what anti-Semitism was. They never met any Jews. The word didn't mean anything to them. We in fact began to use the term anti-Jewish racism. People didn't know there was such a thing, but they were against it insofar as they were told that it existed. They didn't like racism, but they didn't recognize the terminology. But slowly but surely, this began to change for two reasons. First, it became a matter of competence. How could Jeremy Corbyn say that he was against racism and then he couldn't remove obviously racist people from the party? How could his complaints procedure be such a mess? People thought he was probably quite incompetent, that he couldn't do anything. This seemed to prove it. So for a rather odd reason, this undermined his leadership. The other thing is that people thought it wasn't very prime ministerial to be engaged in this kind of battle with one section of the population. People don't have any idea how many Jews there are in Britain anyway, but they thought it was unbecoming. And so in the end, particularly because the chief rabbi spoke out bravely during the election campaign, bravely and unprecedentedly, it turned out that it did matter politically. And it was, I think, behind his general position and his position on Brexit, where he called for a second referendum when half of his own voters didn't want that, it was a reason why he went down to defeat. And that is a reassuring aspect. It did turn out to matter. But it still leaves a puzzling question, which is, how can progressive people be anti-Semitic? And Deborah provided, I think, some brilliant insights, and I just want to add to those another wing of that particular argument. And it came to me when I was reading a slightly arcane book, The Communist Party of Great Britain, an Historical Analysis to 1941. And it was written by a man called Andrew Murray. Andrew Murray was one of the chief advisors, is in fact one of the chief advisors to Jeremy Corbyn, somebody who'd been a member of the Communist Party up until the time that Jeremy Corbyn became leader. He, in this book, defends the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In 1995, he's still describing the fall of the Berlin Wall as an historic setback for human progress. But nevertheless, this extraordinary book did open my eyes, where I finally think I understood this big mystery. And it's all to do with Lenin's theory of imperialism. You might find it odd to mention Lenin, but as Andrew Murray himself in his most recent book mentions him 80 times, I don't feel that attaching it to Jeremy Corbyn is unreasonable. Lenin argued that capitalism is only economically sustainable because companies seek profits abroad. They then need governments to protect their foreign investments through military adventure. So imperialism protects capitalism, and to bring down capitalism, you have to bring down imperialism. So anti-colonial resistance movements are the one true type of anti-capitalist movement that actually works. Iran, Hugo Chavez, Hezbollah. Why does this lend itself to anti-Semitism? Well, first, because anti-imperialists, people like J.A. Hobson, to whose book on imperialism Jeremy Corbyn had wrote a preface, not noting that J.A. Hobson was one of the most notorious anti-Semites of his day. They have always seen Jews as the owners of the finance houses on whose behalf racist imperialism is conducted. In other words, these particular anti-imperialists are anti-racists who blame the Jews for racism. The second thing is because anti-imperialists see the great world empire now as the United States. It sees the Middle East as the center of this empire, and it sees Israel and Zionism, the Jews in other words, as the great creators and symbols of this imperialism. So for reasons that begin in a progressive analysis of capitalism, they end up in a position where they have anti-Semitic allies, where they believe anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, where they have anti-Semitic tropes, something that had perplexed me before I read and understood what Andrew Murray had written became a lot clearer to me once I've done so. But what it means is that left anti-Semitism isn't a few stray tweets, it isn't a gaffe, it isn't an organizational failure, it is a complex, deeply held system of thought that even now Jeremy Corbyn has been defeated, will still have to be taken on and eradicated. Thank you.
Okay, we have two people here with the microphones. It's question time, and yes, please remember short questions, no monologues. Yeah, that would be wonderful. The young man over there. Meredith. Oh, okay. If that takes longer, Meredith, can you give it to the gentleman over there? Thank you.
My question is, why are we still using the term anti-Semitism, a term rooted in race science of the late 19th century, as opposed to a more direct term like Jew hatred?
Yes, could
Well,
you?
I think actually I've begun to argue that we should use Jew hatred, but it's not really rooted so much in the idea of race science. Wilhelm Marr, who popularized the term, he didn't create it, was looking for a better term, more all-encompassing term than Judenhass, Jew hatred, because he wanted to say that even a Jew who doesn't observe Judaism should be hated. So he used that term. It's become connected to it. I intersperse the term often with Jew hatred, but if you do use the term anti-Semitism, it should not be hyphenated, because it's not it's not being against Semitism, it's Jew hatred.
And I think now we can get the young gentleman over there. Yes, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for all your presentations. They were very enlightening. One thing that particularly struck me was Professor Lipstadt's comment about, paraphrasing here, having those, bringing those kind of uncomfortable conversations to the table. And as a very early career historian who often finds his head kind of buried in the sand of the details and the nitty-gritty, and then tries to have these conversations with people outside of that world. I wonder, as has been made clear through your movie, you don't engage with Holocaust deniers outright. So how do you find the correct kind of balance of who can we find that's salvageable? Mm-hmm. And how do we determine what internet trolls and political figures we just brush aside and say it's hopeless? How do we kind of...
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to figure it out. But I think one of the things I do in my book is I talk about the fact that the extremist anti-Semite we all recognize, just like we recognize the extremist racist. But there are other kinds. There's the dinner party anti-Semite. The person who says, oh, we just hired a new young associate. He's an Orthodox Jew, but he's very honest. You know, that kind of thing, which is very insidious. It's sort of, there's a writer for The Atlantic, Franklin Foer, who defines a philo-Semite as an anti-Semite who likes Jews. You know, I like Jews because they work. We even have a president who said, I want, you know, short guys with yarmulkes being my accountants. So it's that turning around. My not engaging with Holocaust deniers, and I think both my panelists, the colleagues here would agree and totally, is because they're liars. You can't debate a liar. They're not an other side of the opinion. I wouldn't debate an anti-Semite, but I would show the stupidity of what they're saying, or the illogic or the hatred of what they're saying. So I would call them out, not to engage in a debate. There's no debating it. I'll give you one example, and sometimes these things come to us, I always say, at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, when we had the conversation at 7 o'clock the night before. But a friend of mine was graduating from nursing school. She was with a small group of women she had gone through nursing school with. They're all from the Midwest of the United States. None of them had really ever encountered Jews before. They had become very close with my friend's family who lived in New York. A very observant family, went to holidays, went to Friday night dinner, loved being part of it. Come fast forward to the luncheon they're having right before graduation, just the group of students, and one of them is talking about what she's going to miss in New York. She's going to miss in New York stores with real bargains. This is before you had bargain outlet malls and things like that. And she said, and she had just discovered this great store in the Bronx, which had things from Saks and from Lord & Taylor. People here will know I'm talking about Loehmann's. But before she began to describe the store and the great bargain, she turned to my friend, the only Jew at the table, and said, "You're really going to be interested in this." And my friend is very quick, and she responded by saying, usually I would come up with a great response at 2 o'clock in the morning. She said, "I didn't know Jews were the only ones to be smart enough to want to save their hard-earned money." So that was the kind of clueless anti-Semitism. So it's not a debate, but it's calling people out. You know, I don't know. Daniel, you're in the public eye, so what?
Yeah, well, I've had somebody once say to me at a party, I always say, never sue. It's the sort of thing that Jews do. So I said, that's funny. Some of my best friends are Jews, like my mother. That's why. My usual response to people who write to me anti-Semitic things is, thank you for your email warning me about the Jews. I'll certainly keep an eye out for them. They sound terrible.
Okay. Yes, I think the lady over there, please. Oh, there were two. Okay.
Thank you, and thank you for enlightening all of us. I have a question that's been puzzling me, and I'm hoping you can further enlighten me. I see the 45th President of the United States as a highly prejudiced, anti-Semitic individual, and yet I see Bibi Netanyahu closely embracing him, and I have a very hard time conjoining those two. How do you see this, and what's happening here?
Daniel?
I think he's making grotesque political error, Bibi Netanyahu, because for the Israeli government to reside all of its faith in the Republican Party, and in particular to this leadership of the Republican Party, assumes that it will last forever. So just at the most basic level, it is a ridiculous political error. But it's also, I think, actually a moral error, personally, because I think I mentioned in passing saying that the right was too busy hating Muslims to have enough time to hate the Jews. And I said that was false comfort, and it really is. I think to believe that someone who holds these prejudices is not going to turn around on you eventually is a really, really naive thing to think. Like a lot of things that Bibi Netanyahu thinks, I just think he's making a big mistake in doing it. But people do that. I understand his transactional belief, but anyone who's done a deal with Donald Trump will know that in the transactions, usually the other party doesn't do that well.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think, though, it's very important to recognize, and I agree with Daniel 100%, excuse me, that it's a mistake, and it's a mistake to do this kind of thing, that Bibi Netanyahu didn't find much support from Western democracies, liberal left Western democracies. And it's very important, not to politically weaponize anti-Semitism. I have friends on the left who have 20/20 vision to seeing anti-Semitism on the right. And they're right, they're seeing correctly. And I have friends on the right who have 20/20 vision to seeing it on the left. They never see it next to them. So I think that's...
Yeah, that's the usual point.
I think my question follows up a little bit the last one. How do you perceive the Jewish support to leaders that some of them are anti-Semitic, others are racist, or others just use a lot of this kind of conspiracy theories in Europe and South America, not to mention here?
I don't know what you mean by Jewish support.
For instance, I'll tell from where I come from. I'm from Brazil. There is a great support by many members of the Jewish community to Mr. Bolsonaro, who's perceived as a good friend of Israel and certainly of Netanyahu, while he's very homophobic and racist and so on. But Jews perceive that he represents a safe place for them and a great support for Israel. And I think the same thing could be said about certain groups in Italy and in Hungary and Poland and so on.
I think the same thing I just said a moment ago in my postscript to Daniel's comment is that I think it's a mistake, but I think one has to also ask, why would they end up in the arms of someone who was so despicable? Where were they made? I mean, the same thing happened in Britain, in that many Jews who had no desire, and not saying the Conservative Party is despicable, absolutely not, but who had no desire to vote for the Conservatives, for the Tories. Isn't that true? It just, you know,
Sense of political homelessness.
the sense of political homelessness, because the Labour Party made it very clear they weren't the least bit interested, or at least the leadership of the Labour Party. I'm sitting with two Brits here. I shouldn't be.
Well, yeah. I mean, just to add this, my mum always used to say about the people who were, you know, she spent quite a bit of time giving Holocaust education and spent quite a little bit of time with other survivors. And she used to say, you know, some of them are quite difficult or querulous or like anybody else, right? They're not saints like anybody else. And in exactly the same way, Jews are like anybody else. So some of them will be homophobic, right? That just stands to reason, because a lot of people are. And so the interesting question would be, of a person of a given social class, and political background, does being Jewish make them more or less likely to vote for Bolsonaro, right? And I suspect it possibly makes it less likely, but without that kind of statistical knowledge, you can't say, will any Jew support somebody like that, because Jews have different political opinions.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I give you mine. This is our journalist.
Thank you. I'm actually asking a question on behalf of a friend of mine who made Aliyah and happened to be in New Jersey shortly after the mass murders in Jersey City. And I knew this was coming. She said to me, "You're living in denial." And I wanted to ask the experts here, with your historical perspective, are Jews in the U.S. safe, or should we be packing our bags?
Absolutely not packing our bags. That's an extremist kind of view. It's alarmist. This is not 1938, not 1933, it's not 1938. I'll tell you a story that I once heard at the Holocaust Museum from a gentleman who had grown up in a smaller town in Germany. The school in that town, which he went to, what we call the public school, became overtly Nazi. I mean, everybody in it, the teacher showed up in a uniform of some segment of the Nazi party, and the kid was having a terrible experience, so the parents sent him to a Jewish boarding school in a larger city. And on the night of Kristallnacht, the teachers came into the building, said, "The synagogue of this Jewish school is burning, get out, run out." And the kids ran out in their pajamas, and they got outside, and they said they didn't know where to run to. And channeling Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' mother, they said, "We're going to look for the helpers. We're going to go to the policeman." And they ran up to the policeman, and the policeman with a sneer said, "I don't help Jewish children." That's not today. There's nothing compared to today. So your friend who wants to maybe make you feel uncomfortable to justify his decision or whatever it is, I think it's short-sighted and it's silly.
Thank you for your amazing presentations. The topic is past and present and the impact of the past, but I was wondering, how do you see the tying together of anti-Semitism definition with anti-Zionism, which is something that many Jewish organizations are fighting for? The European accepted it, the Israeli representative are seeing something positive in it. But from time to time I wonder, and as a historian, how do you tie it together? What is the impact? What does it do to the whole concept of anti-Semitism, etc.?
Sure. The connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I don't know if you want to weigh in on that. You want to know?
You go first.
Okay. Look, what do you do about Satmar Hasidim, who are violently anti-Zionist? On the march last month in Brooklyn, across the Brooklyn Bridge, some of you may have been there, we went onto the bridge and as we came off, there were a group of Satmar Hasidim saying Zionism is the fault or whatever it is. So I think you have to be careful. However, having said that, so that it doesn't, not everybody who disagrees with there being a Jewish state is ipso facto an anti-Semite. Having said that, someone who says, well, we should just have there should just be a Palestinian state or a one state with an Arab majority or something. And I say, well, where should the Jews go? And they channel Helen Thomas and they say, back to Poland. Of course, 60%, over 60% of the Israeli population it would not be considered Caucasian. Israeli Jewish population are Jews are not Caucasian Jews. They're not from Poland. They're from Iran. They're from Iraq. They're from Egypt. They're from Yemen. They're from Morocco. So the glibness with which people are willing to say, 6 million people should just go someplace else or something, makes me wonder. And also and here I have no question with tying the two together, in many of the critiques, not critiques of Israeli policy. Critiques of Israeli policy is not anti-Semitism. Many people, I would guess, are critical of American policy now. They're not anti-Americanism, just like many people who might love American policy now, 4 years ago, were criticizing it. So that's not. But when there's a myopic view of Israel as the only one wrong in this crisis, or the explaining of the problems using anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Semitic explanations, then I have to wonder, where is that coming from? Or the one other thing, and with this I'll turn it over to my colleagues, lately I've been hearing, Israel was founded in sin, therefore it has no right to exist. So I asked the person who said this, who didn't know who he was talking to, poor him, but I wasn't going to reveal. What did he mean by that? And he said, because they chased the Arabs out. And I said, that's not entirely true. Many left because imams and Arabic-speaking radio stations from Egypt, from Jordan, from other places were saying, leave, and you'll come back in 10 days and you'll get the Jews' homes and their houses will defeat them, etc. But there were places where Jews fighting forces chased out Palestinians. We know that, chased out Arabs. That point, every Palestinian, Jews, Palestinian, Arabs was the nomenclature. So when I acknowledged that, he said, well, they were founded, there's a sin in it. Country can't exist like that. So I said, let's put that in a larger historical context. And let's think of other countries which have founding sins in their history. Let's start with Britain and colonialism. Let's start with the United States of America and our treatment of the Native Americans and slavery. And let's not comfort ourselves that we live in the North, therefore the North benefited quite a bit, and let's not comfort ourselves that my family came here after slavery was over because there was neo-slavery for at least 100 years. Or let's look at Canada and the treatment of the First Nation. Or let's look at Australia and the treatment of the Aborigines, or New Zealand and the Maoris. In other words, I'm not saying Myanmar and the Rohingya, or Syria and minorities there, or China. I'm saying other countries. And I'm not saying, I said to him, I'm not saying that makes it all right. They didn't. But no one is questioning the right of those countries to exist. So when you begin to take that myopic view, then I have to ask, where's that coming from? And that's where it comes to anti-Semitism.
So my grandfather was not actually a Zionist. He was one of the leaders of the German Jewish movement and integrationist, and one of the leaders of the community. And he actually wrote a book on Zionism called Travels in Palestine. He was an Arabist, and he wrote a book saying we can't move there. It's like there are people living there already, and it's miles to the nearest deli. Who wants to go there, right? So, and the Zionists replied to him, if we don't go there, we're all going to die. Okay, and he would say, if we do go, the people who live there will resist us. And the great tragedy of the Jewish people is they were both correct. And Amos Oz has this thing where he says, when his father was a young man, he had the signs all over Europe, which Jews go to Palestine, and now the signs all over Europe say Jews get out of Palestine, right? And I think, despite all of the problems of the creation of the State of Israel that my grandfather had seen, the need for its existence was established by the fact that his daughters ended up being in a concentration camp and his wife starved to death, and he ended up in exile, and the country was necessary. So my view is, at the same time as fighting anti-Semitism, and at the same time as being prepared to be completely critical of the Israeli government, anti-Zionism has to be fought too, because of the absolute necessity of the existence of the State of Israel to the Jewish people. And if people go as far as to argue that it should not exist, or to make arguments that amount to the same thing, which is, there should be a singular secular state, which is effectively to say it should not exist, and is a phony argument, because that's not what would take its place. That argument has to be resisted. And I also point out this, when someone throws a rock at a Jew, you don't pick it up and go, I wonder whether that was an anti-Semitic rock or an anti-Zionist one.
Yeah, I'm glad we are addressing all the elephants in the room. Who is...
There's one in the back.
Oh, there's so many. Okay. Who was first? I don't want to be unfair. Okay, Susan is... So who was ahead? Okay, the one who was ahead. Okay. I know. Good. Can you get to him?
Thank you very much. When I was growing up, my parents, who were Holocaust survivors, rightly or wrongly, used to say to me that when it came to the anti-Semitism that they experienced, the Germans were bad, but the Poles were worse. And recently, or relatively recently, the Polish government passed a law, I guess, saying that it was against the law to tie the Polish people and the government to any complicity in the Holocaust. And while this isn't strictly Holocaust denial, it seems to be a denial of facts related to the Holocaust. And I'm just wondering, Professor Lipstadt,
I write about this in my book. What you're talking about is a law that the Polish government issued a little less than 2 years ago, saying correctly that one shouldn't talk about Polish concentration camps or Polish death camps, because they were not Polish death camps. They were death camps erected by the Germans in occupied Poland. Then the second element, which is what you're referring to, is that they said that they made it criminally illegal to talk about the collaboration of the Polish people, the Polish state, because there was no state, in the Holocaust. And that got a very strong reaction, including from the representative of the State of Israel, the Israeli Foreign Ministry, etc., saying that this is soft-core Holocaust denial. They went after people, Jan Gross, a person who used to teach here at Princeton. They went after Jan Grabowski, who teaches at the University of Iowa, both born and raised in Poland, for Jan Gross for his work Jedwabnia, and Grabowski also for Polish participation, and other they went after Polin, the new Museum of Polish Jewish History, etc. About last summer, I would guess, no, I'm sorry, summer of 2018, they made a few adjustments in the law, and they changed it from being a criminal punishment to a civil punishment. And it was embraced by the government of Israel, the present government of Israel, and was severely criticized by historians left and right, myself included. I talk about it in the book. But going back to your first premise, the Poles were not worse than the Germans. The Holocaust was something created, designed, directed by the Germans. Many Jews from Poland interacted with Poles more than they did with Germans. But this was a German enterprise, assisted by Ukrainians, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, et cetera, et cetera. There were Poles who absolutely not collaborated. There were Poles who turned Jews in, who said there's a Jew hiding here, there's a Jew hiding there, or when the Jew, will we get their money, will we get something like that? And there were many wrongs done. But the notion that the Poles were worse than the Germans
Can I just add something to that? Well, in the last fortnight, I've discovered something about my mother's story which relates to this. I'd always known that the reason that that her life was saved, that she was put in Belsen rather than sent to Auschwitz, and that from Belsen she actually was on one of the very rare exchanges, is because they possessed a Paraguayan passport. And my family has no relationship with Paraguay. There's no one never lived in Paraguay, and has nothing to do with it. So I've always wondered where these passports come from. Well, our latest piece of research has discovered that a group of Poles in exile at the Polish embassy in Bern created thousands of these by buying them off the Paraguayan consul, filling them in and paying him off to sign them. And one of these documents we have, and saved my mother's life. It is true that all these stories of Poles that you tell are true, but there are also other stories of righteous Poles who did the right thing, and that deserves to be mentioned too.
But today the Polish government is trying to rewrite the history, and there you're absolutely correct. Yeah. And they're trying to rewrite it. They're trying to decide who should be the next director of Polin, which has become a very big debate. A wonderful museum, but they want to control it. They tried to control the training at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the museum. They are intent on doing this, and sadly, they're not getting enough pushback, I think, as they should be getting.
It's an analogous situation in Hungary.
Yes,
today
you
as
would talk
well,
about
so,
that,
yeah,
right? Hungary rewriting of history. We Hungarians were the victims.
And the House of Terror Museum that was opened, and this memorial as well to the Hungarian victims of the war.
Right.
Rather than
and the attack on Soros, because he's for democracy. And I've even heard Jews say, well, he was a Nazi. Hello, he was 14 years old during the war. I mean, let's be a little realistic.
Okay. Yes, there's. Could you give it to the gentleman down here? Yeah.
In the last few years, I've been reading a number of articles and studies about how the spread and the continuing just below the boil of prejudices of all kinds, including anti-Semitism, is largely the result of the ease with which disinformation and misinformation is continuously recirculated. And I've been reading studies that talk about how to inoculate people against this kind of disinformation through what is now called pre-bunking, as well as debunking. I was wondering if you could comment on how those kinds of strategies can combat not only anti-Semitism, but disinformation and deliberate misinformation of all kinds.
I'm not a specialist in I don't know, do you have a, but it's true. When I started to work on Holocaust denial, if you wanted Holocaust denial material, you got it in a plain brown envelope to a post office box. Now all you have to do is go to Mrs. Google and she'll tell you in 30 seconds, put in Anne Frank's diary, and in certain ways, the way you configure it, sometimes the third or fourth source is a denial source. So it's very much there. And it's all forms of prejudice and hatred. As I said, the moral guardrails are down there, but it's coming, maybe it's because we're about to end, right and left. Don't just look across the political, a divide to the other side. It's coming from both sides, and if you only see it on one side, then what I would conclude is you're really not interested in fighting anti-Semitism, you're interested in scoring political points.
Yeah, scoring political points. So, yeah, no political points, I hope.
One thing that you haven't mentioned directly is the BDS movement, and I think that unless, I don't know, I mean, I think that's caused a lot of controversy in Jewish communities with the BDS resolution, and I just wondered if you could talk about that.
BDS is not about boycott, divest, or sanction. It's about toxifying Israel, making Israel toxic, making Israel negative, so that the kid who's going on a birthright trip won't announce it in the dorm, but just might sneak off quietly, kind of thing. You can't boycott. Yeah, everybody who boycotts Israel should please turn in their iPhones, should stop using Waze and 1,000 other things. I mean, it's ludicrous. But it's, again, an attempt, if you read the founding documents of BDS, they are for the destruction of the state of Israel. right of complete return, 5 generations of Palestinians. In no other refugee movement do you get that kind of sweeping thing. And it calls for, as Daniel was saying, one secular state. Name for me one Muslim state, secular or otherwise, there is none that is secular really, in which a religious minority is thriving. Any religious minority. You know?
In Germany, BDS was declared anti-Semitic in the German parliament in May 2019.
Right.
So we have the BDS problem as well in Germany.
Right. I'm not sure that declaring it anti-Semitic by the Bundestag was tactically the smartest thing, but it is at its heart.
We're trying our
Yes,
best.
but
Yeah,
no, good intentions. But
good intentions.
It was pushed by the Jewish community, right?
Okay. Do we have? Wait a second. I think we are coming to an end now because we have also a book signing. So if you want to buy Deborah Lipstadt's book or Julie Gottlieb's, we are going to set up a table here, and you can just come up to us and we have more discussions. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you so much for our speakers. Thank you.